We've been talking through this very interesting seminar about the connection of Islam to Jerusalem, and that can have many different angles to it. I think what's particularly interesting is in the diplomatic realm of how Western powers understood its significance. And I'm not going to trace this back to prior to World War I, but deal with rather recent events. Right before the convening of the Camp David summit in July of 2000, Richard Clarke had been the advisor on counterterrorism to President Clinton on the National Security Council. Brilliant man with a lot of insight and a lot of experience. And in his memoirs, there's this little revelation that gives us somewhat of an insight into how the general issue of Arab-Israeli peacemaking was seen back in the year 2000, and perhaps why such a huge effort was made with presidential prestige put on the line to try and resolve this conflict, with, of course, Jerusalem at the core of this effort. Well, what Richard Clarke says was that, and again, looking at why the effort was worth making, he says, if we could achieve a Middle East peace, much of the popular support for al-Qaeda and much of the hatred for America would evaporate overnight. Now, we know that Jerusalem had been so much at the center of the Camp David summit, particularly at the end. But is it true that if the issue of Jerusalem had been resolved at Camp David, the United States would have succeeded in lowering the flames of radical Islamic rage against the West? Was this the magic formula for doing that? For preventing 9/11 from occurring? You know, one could analyze this in a very careful and analytic way and try and look over the 1990s as the peace process progressed from the first Oslo Agreement in 1993 to the Gaza-Jericho Agreement in 94, to the Interim Agreement in 95, to the Hebron Agreement in 97, to why in 1998, whether these events in the peace process in fact were treating this growing problem of al-Qaeda during that decade. Of course, most of us remember that if we take that sequence and look in parallel to what had been occurring in the world of terrorism, we would have seen the first attack on the World Trade Center in 1993. We would have seen in 1995 an al-Qaeda attack in Saudi Arabia. We would have seen in 1998 the attack on the American embassies in East Africa, and of course the USS Cole in Yemen in the year 2000 and finally 2001. In fact, there was no correlation between peacemaking and the extent of activity of al-Qaeda, but nonetheless, this gripped the highest levels of American thinking back at the time. And again, since Jerusalem was at the core of the dispute at Camp David, it must have been assumed that somehow you solve Jerusalem, you address radical Islamic thinking. Nothing could be further from the truth. The man probably most responsible for setting off the current radical Islamic wave, Abdullah Azzam, the teacher of bin Laden at King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah, the man who went with him to Peshawar to found the first centers for helping the Mujahideen fighting in Afghanistan. Abdullah Azzam came from a West Bank town actually, near Jenin, left the West Bank back in 1967, became active in the Muslim Brotherhood in Syria, Jordan, a bit of a time in Egypt, till finally he was kicked out of Jordan and he goes to Saudi Arabia. But in the 1980s, when Abdullah Azzam went to Pakistan, and then of course into Afghanistan, did he think of joining the First Intifada? Did he think of becoming involved in the liberation of Jerusalem? He was oriented elsewhere. He was oriented towards fighting the Soviet Union thousands of miles from here. That was the struggle which ignited what we know as Al-Qaeda and the radical Islamic threat to the West that we experienced. It didn't occur here. It didn't erupt here. Another interesting case is the case of Ayman al-Zawahiri, who is now the head of Al-Qaeda, the successor to bin Laden, his deputy for many years. In 1995, he wrote a very interesting article, which has been summarized in a number of places. The way to Jerusalem passes through Cairo. Now, what does that mean? What that meant in al-Zawahiri's writing was that, well, right now, Jerusalem is protected, not just by Israel, but by friendly, moderate Arab states around it. So if you want to get to Jerusalem, you have to topple the Arab states. You have to topple Mubarak, in his case. But he could have easily been speaking about the Hashemites in Jordan. But the direct point was not to deal with fighting for Jerusalem, but actually fighting for overthrowing the pro-Western pragmatic states in the Arab world. So we don't see a sign from either Zawahiri or from Abdullah Azzam that Jerusalem was the goal to reach. So that in radical Islam, there's some kind of dissonance between the expectations in the West that this is the key to dealing with radical Islamic intentions and combating the radical Islamic phenomenon. We see there's some kind of distance we can't explain. Now, there may be a number of explanations for this. Mordechai Kedar mentioned a very important figure for understanding perhaps the radical Islamic outlook is a man from the 14th century, not from the 1990s. His name was Ibn Taymiya. And Ibn Taymiya was an interpreter and a commentator on Islam. And his significance today is that Ibn Taymiya's works are studied in Salafist, radical Islamic circles. The man who founded Wahhabism, that doctrine of Sunni Islam that grew in the Arabian Peninsula, was a man by the name of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in the 18th century. And in his early education, he went to religious centers and sat with the works of Ibn Taymiyyah and copied them by hand. In fact, because of his investment in Ibn Taymiyyah, Saudi Arabia publishes the works of Ibn Taymiyyah, even translating parts of them into English. I think they have a Pakistani translator. But nonetheless, he's important to understand. Now, you have to understand, in the 14th century, what was the preoccupation of Ibn Taymiyyah? His main preoccupation was the fact that in the previous century, the Mongols had conquered the Middle East. They had turned into Muslims, they had converted, but their Islam could not be trusted because they brought foreign influences into Islam in the 13th and 14th centuries. And guys like Ibn Taymiyyah wanted to remove the foreign influences to go back to the pure Islam of the 7th century. And that was their kind of point of departure for looking at many Islamic issues. Now, I'm going to quote Ibn Taymiyyah so you just get a sense of how he felt. He said, "And in Jerusalem there is not a place one calls sacred, and the same holds true for the tombs of Hebron." He pointed out that during the period of the 4 rightly guided caliphs, there was no Dome of the Rock, and they did not glorify this rock. And he goes on with the whole history of how Jerusalem acquired sanctity. Now, what's of course important is that if this 14th century Islamic writer is so revered by the most radical elements, first from Saudi Wahhabism and from there into the various movements that it generated in the 20th century, then what do they do about Jerusalem? Look, Jerusalem can be important in Islam, and we don't have to deny that. But at the same time, to turn it into the penultimate issue that is generating Islamic rage against the West is simply a distortion of their own history and of any understanding of the roots of the radical Islamic philosophies today. Let me take this into another area as well, because many who would suggest in the West that Jerusalem is so paramount for radical Islam and for addressing the threat of radical Islam, those people would pressure Israel to redivide Jerusalem, to apply perhaps a misinterpretation of UN Security Council Resolution 242, which never mentioned Jerusalem, but apply it to the case of Jerusalem and accept the 67 lines. Now, let's think about the day after. What would happen if an Israeli government lost its backbone, its will, succumbed and accepted the idea that Jerusalem must be divided again? Well, let's say they worked out something about the neighborhoods with overpasses and underpasses and who knows what. What happens the day after? Now, our experience, the last time Jerusalem was under Jordanian rule, was that, first and foremost, we were denied access. We were denied access to the Western Wall, to the Temple Mount, to our holy sites, Rachel's tomb. But something else will happen that I don't think we have paid enough attention to. It happened in 48, which was the destruction of ancient synagogues. But I think something is happening in the radical Islamic world that I think we have to internalize and stress. Many of you might remember that when the Taliban came to power in 1998, one of the first things they tried to do was to destroy 2,000-year-old Buddhist statues in the Bamiyan Valley. They first used aircraft launching missiles at the Buddhas. Didn't work. And they actually finally destroyed the Buddhas in 2001. It took a few years. But during the period that they were considering destroying this ancient heritage of a pre-Islamic civilization, Buddhism, there was a discussion in the Islamic world whether this was a worthy thing to do. Should the Buddhas be destroyed? There are a number of Saudi Wahhabi clerics who wrote on this. But one of the most important people to pay attention to is a man who's still very much out there in Islamic consciousness, Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, who is sometimes known as the spiritual head of the Muslim Brotherhood. The Egyptian Qaradawi, who lives in Qatar and has a television show on Al Jazeera. The initial reaction of Qaradawi to the threat to the Bamiyan Buddhas was to say, we shouldn't support this. This is a bad idea. And he gave his reasoning as follows. He said, if in an Islamic country these ancient Buddhas are destroyed, then what will happen to Muslim sites and the security of Muslims in Buddhist countries? I'm not sure what he had exactly in mind, but it was raised. Then later he visited Afghanistan, and once the Buddhas were destroyed, he changed his mind. And he supported the destruction of these pre-Islamic sites in Afghanistan. He even went a step further in 2006, this is years later, and he said we have to revisit the status of pre-Islamic sites in Egypt, which is where he came from. Clearly hinting that pre-Islamic sites in Egypt may have to be destroyed. Now, who cares what Qaradawi says? I already said he has his show on Al Jazeera. His fatwas, his religious rulings, appear on the websites of Hamas. And therefore, Qaradawi is not just an individual who is generating a religious view for the Arabs of the Persian Gulf. He's generating a religious view that cuts across the Arab world, the Islamic world, particularly among those who are supporters of the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, Hamas defines itself as the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood. What I saw with the story of the Bamiyan Buddhas is the beginning of a trend. As was described earlier, when Islam spread from the 7th century onward, it had a kind of mixed experience with other religions. We as Jews, actually, when the second caliph, Umar bin al-Khattab, entered Jerusalem, had a positive experience. Why? Because the Eastern Romans and the Byzantines kept us out of Jerusalem for 500 years. And what does Umar do? Umar demands that at least 70 Jewish families, according to one tradition, return to Jerusalem. They built synagogues. One of them was under Har HaBayit, where the Jews prayed, because they didn't have synagogues in the Byzantine period. There were no Jews here to use them. So there were positive experiences. There were experiences, of course, where churches were taken over and turned into mosques, and one could go from city to city, like Damascus, most famous being Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, Istanbul, the great church of Eastern Christianity. There were threats over the years to various ancient sites. There's a tradition that in the 15th century, the nose of the Sphinx was blasted off by a Sufi leader in Egypt. But what we're seeing now, in my judgment, is under the guise, under the direction of radical Islam, an escalation of attacks on religious sites belonging to other faiths. Our own experience here, just in recent years, has been, and we've seen it under the Palestinian Authority, the attacks on Joseph's tomb go back to the year 2000. You know, if you read Mark Twain's Innocents Abroad, he has a description of Joseph's tomb in Shechem, and he describes it as a site that all the religions revere. But today, anyone remember what happened at Kever Yosef, where people came with crowbars to dismantle it, to break the dome of Joseph's tomb, to destroy all the prayer books, Torah scrolls inside? That was just in the year 2000. And it spread. It's an ancient synagogue with a famous mosaic in Yericho, Shalom HaYisrael synagogue, attacked, ransacked. Christian sites. Many of you might remember that in 2002, the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem was invaded by a joint unit of Hamas and Fatah. And they held clergy in there for more than 30 days. And Israel had to question, the IDF had to question, should we invade the church, rescue the clergy, and capture the terrorists who took the church hostage along with the clergy, or not? We had the history of the Saudis in Mecca back in 1979, who actually did go into the Grand Mosque in Mecca to take out Muslim extremists with the help of the French. But in the end, Israel didn't. It just surrounded it. After 30 days, finally we negotiated an agreement, and these men were dispersed in various European countries. But the point is that both Hamas and Fatah did not grant churches, religious sites, the immunity that one would expect, and even we as Jews experienced in a limited, to a limited extent with respect to our religious sites under Islamic rule, even if we were second-class citizens in Ahl al-Kitab and Dhimmis, etc. It was all breaking down. So I go into that, and there are many cases I can take up from the Coptic Church just recently in Alexandria, one after the other, to ask a question to the world. You want us to withdraw from Jerusalem? What's going to happen to its religious sites? In 2007, I was invited to a diplomatic dinner at the American ambassador's home in Herzliya. And the guest of honor was Condoleezza Rice. They had 12 Israelis to come and give their different perspectives. Well, you know how those dinners always turn out. In any event, I was seated next to Secretary of State. I had just written a book, The Fight for Jerusalem. And I turned to her, and I knew she was a religious Christian. And I said, Madam Secretary, you want us to withdraw in Jerusalem? Who's going to protect the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? And I referred to what had happened in Bethlehem. Who's going to protect your religious sites? Hamas? Hamas and Fatah together? How's this going to work? She didn't have an answer. She just asked the ambassador for a notepad so she could take notes. But I think the point has to be made. In the past, we would say Israel has to stay in Jerusalem, have sovereignty in Jerusalem, so that we can protect access in Jerusalem. Access so that we can visit our holy sites, our fundamental rights in Jerusalem. But I would take it a step further. Given the trends that we've been seeing across the Middle East, and by the way, they don't just affect non-Muslims. They affect the war inside Islam. When in 2006, the Al-Askari Mosque was attacked in Samarra, the Al-Askari Mosque being one of the most holy sites for Shiite Muslims, where according to their tradition, the 10th and 11th Imam are buried and the 12th Imam went into his hidden state. Its gold dome destroyed, blown up by Al-Qaeda, by Sunni extremists. So we're going into a new era, and in this new era, it is only Israel that can be the protector of Jerusalem for all the great faiths. And from our perspective as Israelis, I believe that we have a responsibility that goes beyond our own national narrative. It's a responsibility to the world that we have to think about, that we have to internalize, that we have to understand. We must not lose our nerve on Jerusalem. And we must insist, regardless of any negotiation we may go into, not now, in the future, that we will be Jerusalem's protectors and not give up that position, which because of history has been returned to us, but we must not lose. Thank you.
I thank Dr. Gold. You mentioned Qaradawi, and if I'm not mistaken, his latest statement on tourism, that only local Arabs can visit Jerusalem, but those outside cannot. If I'm not mistaken, is a verse either in the Quran or one of the Hadith in terms of Muslims coming to Jerusalem on horseback as sovereigns, and since Jerusalem is under Israeli rule, they can't come. From this podium, you can come if you want to as tourists, no problem. And the other point I wanted to make is that those who have been listening to Arafat before and others, they only talk about the mosques and churches in Jerusalem. There's never a synagogue in Jerusalem. And if you go to the site of the new Arab city northwest of Ramallah, Rawabi, I have it up on my blog. If you look at the facilities that are available, there will be space for parks, et cetera, and mosques and churches. No synagogues in that city. I want to thank everybody who has stayed, those who have left, those who are still with us, the panelists of both sessions, our translators, the staff, the wonderful staff of the Begin Center that cooperated very much with Daniel Pipes and his organization, his people. I want to point out to you that upstairs there are email sign-up sheets for the Middle East Forum, and I want you to be in touch. Information is a very valuable product, and in many cases today, it's fairly free. Do take advantage of everything that is out there. And to conclude the evening, I once again call upon Dr. Daniel Pipes, and I thank you again.
Thank you, Israel, and good evening again, ladies and gentlemen. The hour is late, and I will be very brief. Dr. Sharon mentioned a book that gave us all a chuckle, Muslim Holy Places Before Islam. I want to mention another book, came out in 2003 in English, called Jerusalem in the Quran, and it's 142 pages long. And even more interesting, it was inspired by an article of mine that came out in the year 2000 in the LA Times. And yet more interesting, the author, whose name is Imran Hussein, says, it is true that the word Jerusalem does not explicitly occur in the Quran. And then he goes on for another 142 pages to dilate on how actually Jerusalem is in the Quran. I think this evening showed the utility of having a session on Jerusalem in Jerusalem. It's not just geographic appropriateness, but also the depth of skill and knowledge on this topic in this city, historical, political, media, and international relations. And I thank all the panelists. And I'd like to just give a couple thoughts about the implications of this evening. And I think they're paradoxical. On the one hand, the banal statement that one hears incessantly, that Jerusalem is holy to Jews, Christians, and Muslims, is not quite accurate. Jerusalem is central to Judaism and Christianity, and I think we've established it's not central historically in this same way. That most of the time, Jerusalem has not been central to Muslims. Or to put it in two different lights, it is not in the league of Judaism and Christianity in terms of centrality, and it's not in the league of Mecca and Medina in terms of centrality. That said, Muslim Zionism is real and powerful. And whether it be in the Umayyad period, the Counter-Crusade, the British period, or now the Israeli period, the fervor to take back Jerusalem acquires a fever pitch, and we're now in the middle of that era. So I thank the Menachem Begin Heritage Center, I thank all of you, I thank the panelists, and good night.